Great. Yeah, hi there. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm one of the co-founders of Condens, and I'm responsible for product development here. Maybe a few words before we start. So for us, that's like a new format, and in my mind, it shouldn't be like a lecture, but more like a starting point for a conversation. So especially for atomic research, I think that's a topic that a lot of us have heard of, but it's not widely adopted in like many organizations. And I think all of us, we have to still figure out how does it fit to our research practices? Is it the right thing? And how can we adapt it to the process that we already have? At Condens, we ourselves, we are not following atomic research, at least not in its purest form. And this is why we're not like the super experts in teaching you all about atomic research itself. We want to focus it more on how you can use Condens as a repository for atomic research results. As a start, maybe let us dive in what atomic research is. I think the whole idea was popularized by Thomas Sharon. I think it was around 2017, and he defines it like that: an approach to managing research knowledge that redefines the atomic unit of a research insight. So back then, most of the research results that we had were communicated in large presentations or large reports, and you couldn't access them without accessing the whole report. More on that later, maybe. One clarification, what we're not so much talking about today is this atomic research framework of Dan Pitcock's. This one will probably come up for many Google searches that you do for atomic research, but we want to focus on the core idea of atomic research. So when talking about like the core idea of atomic research, for me, this means it's a componentized research knowledge. That means instead of only having access to the entire report, you have smaller units. For Thomas Sharon, he calls them nuggets. You can call them findings, insights, whatever fits your wording best. And this has multiple, I'd say, advantages over the large reports. It's not trapped inside these large reports. So the smaller topic-based documents can be searched and consumed independently, and you can remix those for different research questions. Also, you can develop those findings continuously and grow your database across projects. So you can synthesize the data across projects and through different research methods, and you can gain a more holistic view. This helps you to develop and refine the collection of research knowledge more in a continuous manner and have like a knowledge base that's up to date and that can be accessed in a self-serve way. And that's also the third point. So you can make existing knowledge accessible. You can learn from existing knowledge. Not every time you have to, have new interviews for a new question. Sometimes it's also good to, research what you already know. And that's counting for both researchers and stakeholders alike. However, I see some potential risks there because as soon as you bring those insights out of the context and out of the reports, it puts a lot of responsibility on the people using it. So depending on your organization's, let's call it research maturity, there are multiple risks that this poses. The first one is, as I said, that the knowledge is out of context. And I think context really matters to understand the limitations of research findings, to understand when findings are valid and for what cases they might not be. I think it matters a lot to know who did we speak to, what did we speak about, when did we speak to that person, what was the state of the product, was it a prototype you were talking about? All of those things matters to correctly interpret the findings. The second risk is cherry picking. And I think that's especially if you make the atomic research findings widely accessible, because especially untrained stakeholders, they will be invited to kind of pick and choose the knowledge that fits their narrative or their argument. And that, I think, is a huge risk for qualitative research in general, because it undermines the trust in it. And the third one, of course, is unmaintained old findings. Because if not maintained well, then it can quickly happen that parts of the repository get invalid or just don't matter anymore. For example, the easiest example would be a usability bug from 2 years ago. The product or the service was in a totally different state and it doesn't matter anymore. So how can Condens help you have the advantages of atomic research and mitigate the risks a little bit? And the core idea for us is here that you as researchers, you can work with the componentized research knowledge, but you decide on the level of access you give your stakeholders. And there are two main components in the app that help you there. The first one is the stakeholder repository. So I would think of it more like as a front stage and backstage metaphor. In the backstage, you as researchers have access to all of the raw data. You synthesize the data there, and you create your findings or nuggets or whatever you want to call them. And then, based on the maturity of your organization, you can decide what kind of outcome you want to publish, because stakeholders in their dedicated interface can only see what you decide to publish. The second building block, I would say, is embedded findings. So this helps you to work in a componentized way and build findings across projects, and then simply drag and drop those findings into larger reports as you want to have them. Let's see if I can jump windows here to quickly show you what I mean by that. Maybe for those of you who didn't use Condens before, in general, in Condens you work in projects, and each project looks more or less the same in terms of the structure. So it has sessions. This is where the raw data lies. Then highlights and charts will help you to make sense of the data. And then we have artifacts. And as an artifact, we call any document that resembles an outcome of your research. So these might be notes, but these might also be findings. And an artifact can be like in various types. Maybe we can go into the settings, because here you see all the artifact types we have in this example project or in this example workspace, but you can define those so it fits your needs. So let's go back here. And here we see, for example, we have some findings. And what I meant with embedded findings is here we would have like a report, and then you can simply use those findings that you develop and drag and drop them in here. When you decide now to not publish those, but only publish the report, then stakeholders can only access the findings through this report and thus cannot take it out of context. This is then maybe, I have to go a little bit down. Okay, this is how the stakeholder repository looks like. So for stakeholders that don't have access to the raw data. And as I said, they can only access those artifacts that you decided to publish. For example, here we would have the one that we just edited, and you have here the findings embedded. And whenever you change the findings, they are changed anywhere. So you don't have to, change it in each report you're referencing it. They can open it here and see how this looks like. Cool. So I think in the center for the whole atomic research is the atomic unit. And for Thomas Sharon, that's called, or he defines it as a nugget. he says it's a tagged observation that is supported by evidence. So what does this mean for the Condens now? How does this translate? So I would say an observation that might be like anything you describe and you interpret. So we might have, for example, a finding for one observation. And I think a good observation should have a descriptive title in a clear, well-structured, scannable description. Then Thomas John says it's a tagged observation. And I think the goal for him here is to make it findable. Back then, I think it was also a tooling problem, that the only concept that we had was tags. And he said he had like different categories of tags, and those were color schemed to know, okay, what kind of category this is. In Condens, we have artifact information. So it's kind of like even better than tags, because you can, as you see here, you can have multiple fields or categories, and then you can define the tags that can be applied here. And that will help you to make your findings findable, and you can use those as filters or groups. And of course, then we have evidence. That's, I think, the most important, or not the most important, but a really important part. For Thomas Sharon, he says you should have like one video snippet that's really descriptive. And this is where I disagree a little bit. I would say it's better to have more than one instance of evidence. So in Condens, you can easily drag evidence, we call them highlights, into your finding, and you can create clusters and highlight reels. And so I would suggest to use more evidence that helps you to show that it's not just one person's opinion, and that also shows you kind of like the ambiguity or a little more detail, I would say. So what are now some tips and tricks that set you up for success when using Condens as your atomic research repository? I think the first chapter here is how to keep your findings organized. And I would really say, take some time and think about what kind of artifacts do you want to have, and how do you define the templates. So templates are kind of the starting point for every artifact that you create, for example, for each finding. And these help you to stay consistent and to make it easier to scan, to make sure all of the information is there and that the format is the same across all of your findings. Also, you should use and maintain those artifact information fields. As I said, those really help you to make those findable. Those help you to filter those. And whenever you want to, regroup them for another research question, it makes things a lot easier. As I said, in Condens, you work in projects. So any artifact is part of one project, but some artifacts, or a lot of them, should be probably across projects. And I would suggest to use a meta project for that. So create a project that's maybe called Global Artifacts or Global Findings. And this you can use to have like a collection of all the global findings, and you can then update those project by project. Whenever you see something in an interview that maybe fits one of those, you can use this to update your knowledge. Also, you should really decide on the level you want to make your knowledge accessible to stakeholders. And you should really think about and assess the UX maturity of your organization. If you have the feeling that it's more like a lower level maturity, then I would suggest to not release findings by themselves, but always add some context, for example, in reports or in a presentation. This really helps to counter the cherry pick bias, because you cannot, go specifically into just isolated findings. If you think your organization has like a higher level maturity, then of course go ahead, publish findings individually, and give your stakeholders access to those individually. Yeah, the last point I want to mention here is, I think finding the right definition of atomic unit is not easy, and it's not the same for every organization. I don't think there's like a, by the book, one size fits it all silver bullet. And also it's important to keep in mind, I don't think there's perfection here, or there's like one right approach. It's a process. at Condens, we try to improve things constantly, because maybe also your organization changes, and what might work now might not work in the future. Cool. That was it from my side. I'm really curious what insights or experience you have with atomic research, and happy to go into the chat.
As I said, please, if you have some thoughts to share, feel free to share them now in the chat, or you can also raise your hand and then I will let you speak. But actually, Max, before we were waiting for some questions to come in, I have one. You mentioned before, Thomas Charan outlined that there is need for single evidence, and that we at Condens challenge this a bit. And I know that we provide or offer several types of artifacts. So maybe you could tell us a bit more about what formats those could be, like in what format you could show your evidence using Condens.
Sure. I think there's two parts of that. You mentioned that we challenge only, as evidence only share one single video clip, for example. And I think when Thomas Charan said that, that's also due to like a tooling problem. Back then, you didn't have a tool like Condens or other repository tools that makes it super easy to, create clips. So that was a lot of work. And so you better pick one really good one instead of a lot of ones that and invest a lot of work. But as this is way easier now, I think it's the better approach to have multiple high quality ones. And then the format of those findings you can have. So we try to give you the freedom and the possibility to create any types of artifacts that you are used to. So at the moment, we have two general document types. That's like an editor type, the one that you saw, but there's also a whiteboard type. This is really useful for affinity mapping and such things. In the future, there will be also like a slide deck type to have presentations, because I know those are still, of course, taking place, and that's like one format that we will also provide in the future.